Welcome. This is my channel and I tell stories of the mysterious, twisted, and paranormal. So please stick around and consider subscribing and turning on your post notifications. I got a story for you today that will entertain you, so relax and enjoy. And remember, as of now, it's time to slip into a mind that's not our own. So let's go. In March 1938, near Naples, Italy, lived Ettore Majorana, who was one of the most foremost physicists of his day. Now, he began his life in, a simple, slow-moving world of the Sicilian countryside. But his brain turned out to be anything but simple and slow-moving. When he was in his teenage years, he was recruited to join a group of whiz kids called the Via Panisperna Boys. And at that time, the group's leader was perhaps the most famous Italian physicist of them all, and his name was Enrico Fermi. And when Ettore went to college, he was already on the fast track to becoming a top-notch physicist. He worked closely with Enrico, and he helped to discover the slow-moving neutrons that would soon make nuclear reactors a possibility. Ettore was, in fact, on the cusp of making a huge finding in his area of physics. But after he unwisely failed to take Fermi's advice to publish his ideas, there was another young physicist by the name of James Chadwick, who beat him to the punch and then won the Nobel Prize for this work. Now, Ettore's inspiration and insight into physics unfortunately deserted him after this huge setback, and he then settled into a routine life and became a professor of physics at Naples University. So with no other huge breakthroughs from him, he decided to just live a relatively accomplished life in academia. But this all changed when he decided to take a spontaneous trip to Palermo, Sicily. And once he left for his trip, he would not return. For reasons that are still unknown, Ettore emptied his bank account just days before his scheduled trip. Of course, if you were seeking to run away from your life and start a new one, taking money out of the bank would make complete sense. But wherever he ended up, there's no evidence that he ever spent it. And then there was an ominous sign that Ettore was planning not to return, and that's because he left a letter to the University of Naples Director of Physics, Antonio Corelli. And it read, "I made a decision that has become unavoidable. There isn't a bit of selfishness in it, but I realize what trouble my sudden disappearance will cause to you and the students. And for this, I beg for you forgiveness, and especially for betraying your trust and the sincere friendship you gave me over the past months. I ask you to remember me to all those I learned to know and appreciate in your institution, especially Skiru. I will keep a fond memory of them, and at least until 11 p.m. tonight, possibly later too." Now, the reference at the end to keeping a fond memory of his colleagues until 11 p.m. is somewhat odd, to say the least, and it could be interpreted as a reference to suicide, and that he planned to end his life before 11 p.m. that day. But, seemingly to contradict this, Ettore sent out a telegram later that night suggesting that he was getting ready to actually return to Naples. Not only that, he already purchased a ticket from a ship. But there is no record that he ever made this trip, and this was the last communication that he ever made. It seems that he took to the seas on Friday, March 25th, 1938, and then was never seen again. Now, in the immediate aftermath of his disappearance, investigators were completely confused and baffled. They had absolutely no idea as to why this brilliant physicist would just suddenly disappear. So a massive search was conducted throughout all of Italy, but no leads were found, and the investigation was soon abandoned because the shadow of war began to loom over Europe, which what we know now was World War II. But this is not the end of the story. There was an incredible update to this case that came in 2008 when a caller to an Italian TV show featuring this very strange disappearance of Ettore offered a new lead. The caller, who was an Italian man named Francesco Fasani, claimed that he actually met Ettore in South America back in the 1950s. Fasani said he had been working as a mechanic in Venezuela, where he made the acquaintance of a man who went by the name of Mr. Bini. But Mr. Bini actually was Ettore, who had been hiding out nearby in Argentina. Furthermore, Hassani actually claimed to have proof and brought forth a 1955 photograph showing a man strikingly similar to Ettore Majorana. So, intrigued by these new findings, the Office of Rome's Attorney General announced that it would reopen the case, and in an announcement that stunned the world after analyzing the photo and other relevant data on June 7, 2011, it was declared that 10 points of similarity could be found between the 1955 photo and previous photos of Ettore. Then, on February 4th, 2015, it was officially announced that there could be no doubt that Ettore was the man depicted in the photograph from 1955. And as far as the Italian government is concerned, the missing persons case had been solved, although there are still many who would disagree. I mean, was this really Ettore? If so, did he develop anything in physics that we know today that he did not get credit for as well? Honestly, I have no idea. But it seems that revelations in this case were found in 2011 and in 2015. So one day we might know more about Ettore and why this brilliant physicist just disappeared off the face of the earth. Either that, or we'll never know it all. Wallace Fard Muhammad is perhaps the most mysterious figure of the 20th century. This story is so mysterious that no one actually knows his real name, or where he came from, or where he went after he disappeared off the face of the planet. Fard disappeared out of nowhere when he was walking the streets in Detroit in 1930, and he presented himself as a door-to-door salesman who sold silk garments, but he was also selling ideas. The silk he had was just a way to initially get his foot in the door, so to speak. So, after he would describe these silk garments of being made of the best silk from Africa, he then explained, at least to the people who would listen, that there was a whole world in which they knew nothing about, in which people like themselves lived like kings and queens, and that were completely free of the racial oppression that was rampant in 1930s in America. This was music to their ears, of course, for the downtrodden. And at the time, with these stories, Fard quickly became very popular in Detroit, and people regularly invited him into their homes so Fard could teach them his exotic beliefs. Now, he would explain that him and his audience had been deceived, and that indeed it was African people who were the true masters of the earth, and the Europeans were an inferior subspecies created by a mad African scientist named Yakub 6,000 years ago. This claim might sound crazy today, but in the 1930s, when eugenics was all the rage, Fard was able to find a huge audience for his ideas, and a huge audience remained fascinated of everything Fard would say. His listeners accepted his ideas, that the Europeans were a bad strain of stock that escaped from an ancient African laboratory. Fard said they were called the White Devils, and indeed were the source of all of their woes. Now, his movement, otherwise known as the Nation of Islam, began to gain traction in Chicago as well as Detroit. But the news was also heard by the police, and Fard quickly became on the radar of the FBI at that time. Now, things seemed to come to a head when one of his temples began to carry out these elaborate rituals that may or may have not involved a human sacrifice or two. Local police began applying pressure and wherever Fard went, from that point on, authorities quickly told him to leave. Fard now realized he was not in a position anymore to head the movement that he founded, so he appointed a successor named Elijah Robert Poole, otherwise known as Elijah Muhammad. And Fard, at this point, moved to the background of the movement. Eventually, Fard left town for good, and Elijah saw him board a plane at the Detroit airport, and that was the last time anyone ever saw Fard again. Or was it? Now, the exact date isn't known, but Fard vanished sometime in 1934. By getting on a flight out of Detroit, as we know, Elijah saw him off, and according to Elijah, he begged him to stay. And he begged him with such authority that Elijah had tears in his eyes by the time Fard dismissed his ideas of staying. But he did give Elijah sort of a goodbye present in a way. He told him a list of books to read and ordered him to carry out the teachings for the Nation of Islam. From there, Fard boarded the plane and then he left. Now, the official stance of the Nation of Islam, which holds Fard as much more than an ordinary man, says that Fard had left this world entirely. Now, the current leader, who is Louis Farrakhan, has repeatedly expressed his interest in UFOs and has said he believes Fard is most likely on an alien spaceship hurtling through the cosmos. Now, there is a more believable explanation, and that is what leaked from FBI memos. The FBI's version of the event said that Fard had been linked to a murder carried out by one of his followers, and at this point, Fard was given an ultimatum to either leave the city immediately or face criminal charges. So, FBI or UFO, one thing remains, and that is his departure, just like his arrival, seems to be a complete mystery. Now, the FBI continued to maintain Fard's file, but there wasn't much added between 1934 and 1958. However, due to increased activity of the Nation of Islam under Elijah, the FBI delved into the past once again and made what they felt was a significant discovery. The FBI found striking similarities between Fard and a man that lived in California whose name was Wally D. Ford. Now, Ford had been arrested twice, once in 1918 for assault with a deadly weapon, and again in 1926 for violation of the California Poison Act. And for the Poison Act, he ended up serving, or at least sentenced to, 6 years in prison. Now, FBI agents surmised that when he was released from prison, Ford then appeared in Detroit and changed his name from Wally D. Ford to Wallace Ford Muhammad, meaning that he was released early for good behavior or whatever it was and arrived in Detroit in 1930 and then immediately launched his street ministry. Also, the FBI has 2 sets of fingerprints, one from a 1933 booking of Fard and another one taken from Ford's arrest. Now, these 2 sets of fingerprints, supposedly by 2 different men, were an exact match. And what came from this was the FBI closed the investigation into Fard less than a year later, on April 15th, 1958. Now, since then, there has been a huge amount of speculation on who Fard was, but his disappearance still remains a mystery to this day. So, one day we might find out where Fard went. Either that, or we'll never know at all. Thank you for listening to this story. I will be uploading stories 2 to 3 times every week, sometimes with multiple stories in them like this one. So please, if you enjoyed this, take a moment to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Also, share this to everyone that you know. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.